Hello and welcome to the Secure Start podcast.
And it's my view that it's the difficulties we have in understanding children's sexual behaviour
Mm,
and the difficulties in managing shame and responding to shame that
mm,
keep these problems going rather than there being something particularly wrong with kids. The thing that we discovered in this work is that when children are feeling disconnected, feeling they don't belong, they've got serious problems with connection, when they're feeling that they're nobodies, that they don't matter, that their lives don't have much worth.
mm,
These are conditions really where children are very vulnerable to engaging in harmful sexual behaviour. The focus is put almost in some situations solely on the actual sexual behaviour itself,
mm,
when the issue is about connection and worth.
mm,
Shame helps us be attuned to the possibility of a violation of the boundaries of the other. I see the other for the first time, and that's a form of otherness. That, like, to me, the antithesis of violence is really, sort of a passionate interest in otherness. If we are hoping the person we're working with will stop and think about the experience of the other, particularly the other that they've hurt, what does it mean if we don't stop and think about their experience of us? Shame is that attunement, that sensitivity to the experience of the other that helps us set limits, that helps us respect boundaries, that helps us form discretion where we know where to tread or where not to tread. Guilt doesn't have much affective force. Guilt is more a cognitive idea. I think guilt is often a shame avoidance thing. If I'm a client somewhere and my therapist starts to tell me what I should think or how I should resist that. I should stick up for myself. That person has no right to do that. And I hear that statement, I didn't hurt her. And I hear more than just a denial in that or a minimization. I hear this person probably has some sense of what hurt does.
Hello and welcome to the Secure Start podcast. I'm Colby Pierce, and joining me for this episode is a highly respected former psychotherapist in my own hometown. Before we begin our conversation, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are both coming to you from, the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and acknowledge the continuing connection the living Kaurna people feel to land, waters, culture, and community. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My guest this episode is Alan Jenkins. Alan has worked in a range of multi-undisciplinary teams addressing violence and abusive behaviours for more than 35 years. Rather than tire from the work, he has become increasingly intrigued with possibilities for the discovery of ethical, respectful, and accountable ways of relating. The valuing of ethics, fairness, and the importance of protests against injustice has led him to stray considerably from the path prescribed in his early training as a psychologist towards a political analysis of abuse. Alan's most recent publication is Becoming Ethical, a parallel political journey with men who have abused, published in 2009. Alan was the director of NADA, an independent service that provided intervention in family abuse, violence, and workplace harassment. He managed the Mary Street program for young people who have engaged in harmful sexual behaviour, along with their caregivers and communities, and so much more. So, Alan, welcome to the Secure Start podcast. Um, I've just in the video, in the final product, I've just read your bio, and I was particularly interested in one one curly term, um, and I was very
Mm.
concerned that I would mess it up. You refer to multi-undisciplinary teams, and I wonder if you'd just um, tell us a little bit about what an multi-undisciplinary team is.
Well, teams like the Mary Street program and various um, teams that I've managed, uh, we are somewhat anarchic, I think, in our in our nature. We we tended to often take exception to some of the kind of rules and imperatives and expectations about what a team should be, even who should compromise it. Like we
Mm,
tended to employ people because we thought they were really good at what they did, rather than because they were of a particular profession or
right.
something that fitted. Um,
Mm,
and I like the idea of people in a team that I'm in being innovative and experimental and trying out new things. So
mm,
rather than being caught in a certain dogma,
mhm,
that they were free to improvise. And
mm,
we would work together. Like we had a form of accountability, I think, that was really present. But
mm,
I loved I loved it when people went off script and tried
mm,
something new and shared it. And we developed a lot of exciting projects from that kind of notion. And I suppose it's a bit of a take on the idea of a multidisciplinary team, which
yes,
we
yes.
were somewhat
Tongue in
undisciplined.
cheek. Yeah, yeah. Alan, the other thing I would say is that as a psychologist, I kind of grew up in the knowledge of your work and in the knowledge of you practicing the profession. Um, well, I won't. I'll let you decide whether you were practicing psychology or something more inclusive, I guess, of various traditions. But suffice to say, I grew up as a psychologist, aware of your work, and in particular, I think the one of your initial writings, Invitations to Responsibility. Um,
That's
did I
going
get
back.
that's going back, and that was a publication that related to your work with men who committed domestic violence.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose it fits with the idea of the multi-disciplinary and the I never felt a very strong sense of belonging in the psychology fraternity,
Mm,
or it was largely a fraternity. um, and like I came into this work through more politics, through more a political understanding of how the world works. And because I began in the 70s, when there was
mm,
a time of political change and upheaval and issues of family violence, of sexual assault were being named. And, a woman's movement was being developed. And to me, this was really exciting. And it felt to me a political analysis of behavior around sexual violence, physical violence, was far more helpful than a psychological
mm,
analysis, which seemed to locate problems within people, within people's either psychopathology or deviance or whatever,
mm,
where to me, the work I saw was intensely political rather than psychological.
mm,
Um, yeah. So
mm,
uh, I, I look back at I to make sense out of it with this particular topic around harmful
mm,
sexual behaviour in children. I mean, we set up the Mary Street program because we noticed um, that a large percentage of children experiencing sexual harm, that harm was done by another child.
mm,
In fact, in our experience back then, we thought it was probably around 40 to 50% of what we knew about. And we didn't have very good data generally in the community. But it struck me as that the problems were not within these children. It's not something that people tended to think about it. Well, what's wrong with that child, or why is that child doing that? The problem was much more within the networks, the sort of communities, what I tend to call them the assemblages of the links between people and ideas and institutions, that really had very limited understanding. They were very reactive to children's behaviour. And they, with this harmful sexual behaviour, there was either a tendency to want to pretend it wasn't there, and they're not really, and that's a sense of shame. We don't want to see this. We can't bear this, that this is happening. Or more recently, as it's become more known about, to start to weaponize shame and to act in shaming ways, which really are quite judgmental and punitive towards children. So I guess I'm interested in the politics of those networks and how they actually operate and what they do. And it's my view that it's the difficulties we have in understanding children's sexual behaviour and the difficulties in managing shame and responding to shame that keep these problems going, rather than there being something particularly wrong with kids.
And would you say that that's the least well understood aspect of harmful sexual behaviours amongst children and young people, or would you say that there are other aspects that are also not well understood?
I would say that's the main thing that maintains, that keeps harmful sexual behaviour going. And perhaps to look at, like, I guess some of these realisations, it's probably about over 40 years ago now. Gosh, it's going back. But we had the Mary Street program established, and I would have a number of referrals there from schools where there'd been a sexual assault or a harmful sexual act taken place within a school community. And usually they might have been 12, 13-year-old boys generally, it was generally a girl who was subject to that behaviour. And, I'd have situations arise where, look, I'll try and combine examples so I don't identify any particular school or anything. But it might be a 11, 12-year-old boy who'd sexually assaulted a girl on the school oval, and there may have been a group of bystanders who had watched and had done nothing. And the school's response typically was that they would, in those days, they would suspend the boys for perhaps 4 weeks, and they'd contact us to see what we could do about it. But say in the meantime in this school, probably what tended to happen is there would be very little facing of what the impact of this was in a school community. So, like, for example, it might be that the boy suspended was the local football hero. The school lost the grand final. And gradually the girl was ostracised within the school and almost seen she was the problem that had caused. And the girl would have to leave the school, and go somewhere else. And I would go to the school and I would kind of notice shame, like that. I would notice that shame, but shame avoidance, people trying to erase it, to try and rub it out or make things go back to normal. I'd meet with the teachers group, and I'd find about, say, a third of the teacher group might be really hostile about the boy and what he'd done. Another third had the sort of attitude, boys will be boys, this sort of thing happens, get on with it. and another third perhaps in between somewhere like that. But I noticed in a couple of these schools that rape jokes started to be present in the staff room. I see a school that was just not dealing with the impact of this in their community, like that girls were feeling unsafe in this place. What about the boys who witnessed this and were bystanders and did nothing? How are they experiencing that? Looking at what's happening in this school, people are saying, or communicating in a way that we can't bear this. Make it go away. Let's get back to normal. There was that attitude of a sort of a shame avoidance, of a wanting to just pretend this didn't happen and it hasn't had any impact. And of course, I found, well, how could you intervene in a school like that without having a whole school culture that started to look at what's happened here, which was quite a challenge in a number of schools. But then, we gradually started to have people take harmful sexual behaviour and sexual assault more seriously. And then, of course, you start to find, if you get what you wish for, sometimes you, and I look at current times where attitudes towards kids who engage in harmful sexual acts have become quite punitive, have become isolating of children, have become, judgmental, of setting up forensic assessments that kind of almost demonize children. And, in many ways have tended to, our capacity to respond to this behaviour has always been and still is extremely limited, extremely reactive, and often serves to simply reproduce the conditions that lead to that kind of behaviour in the first place, where kids are feeling they're judged, ordered, they're nobodies, they're disconnected from their peers. And of course, the thing that we discovered in this work is that when children are feeling disconnected, they don't belong, they've got serious problems with connection, when they're feeling that they're nobodies, that they don't matter, that their lives don't have much worth. These are conditions really where children are very vulnerable to engaging in harmful sexual behaviour.
Yes, it's that that observation of the importance of connection and disconnection. I guess that's really stood out for me in reading about your views about harmful sexual behaviours. I do remember, going back 30 years or so, that research into adult harmful sexual behaviour or paedophilia basically taught the importance of connection was known, at least perhaps in some places. I think there was a program in New Zealand that I remember hearing about in my training that saw connection as being really important in a really important mediating variable, for want of a better way of putting it, in sexual or harmful sexual behaviours, or in fact pedophilia, amongst adult men.
Yeah, but in fact, there's a reasonable amount of evidence around now that if you're going to intervene and make a difference with these groups of men, that the establishment of support circles, they're often called, or that structures that provide a connectedness and that are one of the critical factors, that if that's not there, many of these programs are quite ineffective. And when it comes to children, particularly children as they're developing, some of the notions that, like, what often happens when it's discovered or it emerges that a child is engaged in a sexual act that has the potential for harm, that the responses that we have are, well, they're not responses, they're reactions. Like the first thing that's put to a kid is, why did you do it? What's wrong with you? How could you? Now, the children don't know why they did that. They can't answer that question. And when they don't answer, somehow it's almost seen as evasive, or they won't talk, or we'll get the forensic expert to find out what's wrong. Yeah. But the message a child gets in that situation is that what they're hearing is that you're disgusting. You are what you did. You're bad. And so that question of why did you do it, it reflects a lot more about adults' difficulty in accepting that this behavior happens in the first place. It's our own shame avoidance, in a sense, that has us, we can't bear it. Why did you do it? As though there's something that will reveal a magical answer here. And of course, the next thing that happens is the child's told to stop doing it. But it's stop doing it on our terms, with an urgency that we put. And for many children, they're not quite able to just simply make that decision to stop doing it. And so the message they get is that they're not trying, or that they're being deceptive. In other words, the kid's being told you're weak, that there's something wrong with you. And then the third message is really to stay away from other children. So in the name of a safety plan, a child is often safety plans are set up, and there's no taking account of the fact that what this child needs is opportunities for connection. They might need to be supervised opportunities. They might need to be opportunities that have some guidance with them. But very often children are isolated. And the message they get is that, you're dangerous. Stay away from other children. You're not wanted here, in a sense, a message of disconnection. And so we tend to have children in that situation becoming increasingly disconnected and isolated, and increasingly feeling that there's something bad about them. And when a kid feels I don't belong and I don't matter, that's a very dangerous, a very vulnerable, I guess, context to place a child in.
And then expect them to behave.
Absolutely. And so, you wind up with children who becoming increasingly dysregulated, their sense of, when any of us are not fitting in or are not connecting, we panic. There's a panic loss that's felt. And then when we feel we're judged, there's something wrong with us, then shame becomes apparent. And those two, panic and shame, those two affects, when they're dysregulated and kids are desperate to avoid them, we have all sorts of problems.
I love hearing what you're talking about. I think it's so relevant in a number of endeavours. I've already just touched on adult problematic sexual behaviour, including pedophilia. But even in the child protection system, the judgment and shame that is incurred by birth parents really, I guess, flies in the face. I've long felt that it flies in the face of what we know to be the most powerful regulating influence over people's behaviour, and that is their connection with themselves and who they are, their connection with the significant people around them, and their connection with the community. And it's community attitudes and mores and the desire to maintain connection that is a powerful regulating influence.
Yeah, and that connection is the central, the panic about loss of connection is probably the biggest animating factor in leading to inappropriate, harmful kind of connections that children try to make. I mean, I think people, this is one of the problems now, is that there's a tendency to want to forensically examine children and sort of categorize their sexual behavior on what they call them they're not really continuums, but they're called continuums, from normal to moderately harmful to, like, the focus is on the sexual behavior itself rather than on looking at what's happening for that child in terms of their levels of connection with others and their sense of of sufficiency, of worth, of competence. These are the things that we need to be assessing, and yet they seem to be, the focus is put almost in some situations solely on the actual sexual behavior itself, when the issue is about connection and worth.
Is it too simple to say it's about what's regulating and what's dysregulating the children?
No, well, that when panic and shame become dysregulated, when they perhaps if I look at what we learned about children at Mary Street, we soon discovered, as we started to listen to children, which was a novel concept at the time, rather than react to their behaviour. And when children felt safe, when they felt we were not going to be coming down and judging them and relegating them as losers in the loser bin, we discovered that most kids, the pathway into harmful sexual behaviour was generally curiosity. It was generally something that, I think kids should be curious. They should be interested in the world and looking out. And sometimes it was driven curiosity, like when a child had been exposed to some sort of, well, you could have a child that had been exposed to sexually harmful behaviour themselves by another, or you could have a child that had been exposed to some sort of sexual stimuli of some kind, or that they were not able to make a whole lot of sense of, in a way. I mean, that leaves an affective impression with a kid, and so sometimes the curiosity was somewhat driven. But we noticed that it was, for the kids that we saw, they were kids who presented. They were isolated. They had very little secure connection, often even within their families sometimes. But and they felt, so their sense of panic around that was high, and the sense of shame. They were steeped in shame. They would kind of be almost folded up into themselves, and any mention of their behaviour would just fold them up even more. And we looked at how kids, it wasn't anything about a desire to intrude or a desire to harm, or most kids in that situation are quite vulnerable to forms of connection that have low social demand. And of course, sexual behavior is exactly, it masquerades as connection. And it's not surprising that a vulnerable or a younger child will become targeted in this. And if you ask a kid, why you chose that person, and when they're in a space where they can be honest about that, they'll say something like, well, he or she was easy, and the interesting thing is, often in a safe space as they'd say that, you'd see a different kind of shame emerge, the realization that what I did was take advantage. And that's a very different, which we can talk about later on, I guess, form of disgrace that's felt. That's quite ethical, you know. It's of seeing that other child. But coming back to what I was saying, the vulnerability to these kinds of forms of connection that masquerade, and they masquerade as connection, they masquerade as things that build competence.
Power.
And of course, the thing we don't look at, you know, we can be shocked at children engaging in this behavior, but we don't look at the fact that this doesn't arise out of the blue. You know, we have a cultural sexual history in our communities that conflates sex, particularly for males, with success, with conquest, with dominance, you know, with intimacy. Yeah, sex as an anaesthetic, how to deal with troublesome and worrying feelings, you know, sexual behaviour, and of course we've got on the internet, we've got blueprints for how to objectify, how to do objectifying sex or how to do sexual harm are freely available to kids. I mean, you know, it's hardly surprising to me that these forms of behaviour emerge in this kind of situation. And of course, if we don't understand that, or we don't find ways where we can be responsive to that, we wind up becoming judgmental. We subject these kids to the same social hierarchical order that causes the problem in the very first place. You know, our efforts to try and intervene in a problem very frequently exacerbate that particular problem.
Yes. There's a lot I could say about that, but Alan, I want to pick up something that I think you said that was really important just a moment ago, which what's really important, I think, to pick it up, which is that when confronted with their reasons for why the children identified a certain target, there was a reaction that reflected a sense of personal ethics about how you treat others, which I just wonder what your thoughts are about how surprising that would be for people to know that notwithstanding that they've engaged in harmful sexual behaviour, there's that reaction to their own behaviour.
Can I answer that with a story?
You can, yeah. One that is not a specific case, but made up
well,
of...
I'll make it a combination of so there's nobody identified. I'll combine it because it's typical, and it cuts right to the very question you're asking. Because these are typical of kids that will refer to Marys to. They might be 11, 12, 13-year-old, and they'd harmed a child. Perhaps it was in daycare, you know, where this kid had been in a number of placements. Actually, we'll make him an Aboriginal kid in this situation who was seen when he's referred, he's seen as he's uncooperative. He's done this terrible act to this little child, and he won't talk about it. In fact, you know, he doesn't say he didn't do it, but he just doesn't say anything. You know, he doesn't seem to care. He's had all these forensic assessments over time that suggest, and as I read them, I see words like sex offender. You know, I see words like lacking in empathy. I see self-centered. I see, and eventually I see the word conduct disorder, which seemed to be a kind of a nice rubbish
Mm.
bin to put to put somebody who didn't fit anywhere else in. This we'll say this particular kid will he's perhaps been removed from his family when he was, 8 years old. He's been in about 5 different placements. In some, he's actually been subjected to abuse himself and has had to be pulled out of the placements. His school reports are really interesting because he starts off at school and he's not learning, and and they wonder why, and and they don't think that maybe something with his style of learning doesn't fit here, and that he's being racially harassed every day as well. But he's seen initially as having a learning problem, and they bring in the experts, and that doesn't work. And then he's seen as having some sort of perhaps emotional difficulty, and then he's seen as having a bad attitude, and then he's seen as having a conduct disorder in the end. Yeah. And he's aggressive because he's always in fights with other kids, And I meet this kid, and he's steeped in shame, like he's like a Francis Bacon painting. It's sort of almost folding in on it as though it might disappear, and of course I'm not going to ask him about the sexual harm of this child. But I became a bit interested that he got into a lot of fights. And I find myself a bit intrigued with the kids we meet with, because protest is something, like from my earlier political days, Vietnam protest was kind of the central political thing that I thought was important. And I saw this kid, and I started asking him a bit about whether, we got talking into whether he'd stuck up for himself, and a lot of his fights at school, were in. There was an element of protest. Yeah, there was more than protest. I mean, he sometimes did some kind of mean things himself, but there was an element of protest there that I became interested in. And we talked about sticking up for yourself when things feel unfair. And and I talked a bit in my life about sticking up for things. I kind of agree with stuff like that. And then I just started to become interested in, like, he'd got through these 5 placements. He'd been taken away from his family as a little kid, and I discovered that as a 7-year-old, he'd tried to. His dad had left. His mum had a real big alcohol problem and couldn't manage things in the family. And as a 7-year-old, he would go out and get food. He would look after his younger siblings. He would try and look after his mum. When a man came into the house and was going to hurt his mum, he would try and stick up for his mum. And sometimes this guy would kind of call him a waste of space and knock him away when he tried. And of course, he felt ashamed. He felt he couldn't do it. He couldn't look after his mum. He just wasn't. He couldn't manage it. But I also became really interested in why he tried to stick up, why he tried to do those things. And I started to learn, because he loved his mum, He really, he saw his siblings, they needed him, to get food and stuff like that. And so, we and this to me is where shame comes into this, because we hold the sort of shame he felt at not being able to, stand up to these men, to be able to manage looking after his family and things like that as a little boy. But we also hold the story that he tried to protect his mum. He made sacrifices at times. I became really interested in why he did that and why that was important and what that said about him, and so we're having these kind of stories that help to resettle, instead of trauma being processed and winding up with all it says is that you're a shameful, worthless person, culpable person, that there's something else about this young man. Of course, what happens then is you can have all sorts of other conversations. And that's where this, in coming to your question about other forms of shame, of how they work. And I discover with this boy, we start to talk about, something comes up around the girl that he'd abused. And then I noticed his head folds. He folds in on himself. He's clearly feeling intense shame. And I ask him, what are you seeing? What's going on? And he says to me, she was only a little kid. And I said to him, and that's not you, is it? To pick on a little kid. You've tried to stick up for little kids in your life. And he started to cry. And I'm full of wonder, because I'm thinking, how the hell is this boy who's been through all of this crap, who's been done to most of his life, who's not really had anyone stick up for him much, how is he able to stop and feel ashamed about what he did to that little girl? How's he able to find that when he's had so much done to him? How has he been able to survive the 5 placements? How has he been able to try and do his best to look after his mum and stuff like that? Now, that form of shame that he feels at that moment is transformative. That form of shame is imminent. It's not coming from being judged as lesser than. It's coming from a sense, my God, what have I done? How could I have done that? It's an imminent form of disgrace. And it's really what shame is there for. Shame is there to help us to kind of establish boundaries, to establish, it's part of establishing connection with others. Shame helps us be attuned to the possibility of a violation of the boundaries of the other. Shame is about connection. Shame is the shadow of love in that particular kind of notion. And here's this boy, despite everything he's been through, he's able to see that little girl. Shame enables us to see the other, for who and when we do that, if we can help a child or an adult, whoever it is, to hold that in a way. What does it mean that this boy has been able to stop and to be able to see the harm that he's done, to be able to see that child, to be able to see the other? What would it say if that boy could see what he'd done to the other and he didn't feel bad? What would that say about him? Yeah, this is about integrity in a way. And now, obviously, in working with children, I'm really mindful of not overloading them with a kind of that bit by bit, when some of that, what I call mistaken shame, the shame that's attributed by others, you're not good enough, you're too fat, you're this, you're not man enough, or whatever, the kind of that children become oversensitized to and dysregulate. This, when that is managed a bit, then a more imminent form of shame, I think, is able to be accessed. In fact, I don't need to bring it up. I don't shame. If I put shame onto that kid, or if I tell him, you've got to face up to what you've done, you've got to man up here, well, that is a shaming intervention. But if he's in a space where he's recognized what he believes in, he's tried to stick up for his family. He's tries to stick up for himself in fights. In fact, he has stories of sticking up for others. When there's something ethical comes forward about that, then inevitably he will be more likely to experience that kind of imminent shame, that sense of disgrace that comes from you're able to see the other, you're able to, and that moves you in a way which is consistent with ethical connection. So I hope that makes sense. trying to sort of move into a space with a story that looks at
Mm,
shame in that way.
mm. Look, it makes perfect sense to me. I do wonder that, well, there were so many questions I could ask, but one was, um, how would you respond, I guess, and this is a question without notice, and I apologize for that, but people who refer have a very clear idea or very clear expectations about what they think you should be doing when you accept the referral. And so in these circumstances, often enough, people would expect you to talk to the young person about their behavior
Mm,
in therapy.
mm,
And um, and yet, and I totally agree with you, the therapeutic work is not done through directly addressing that behavior head on to the exclusion of anything else. The therapeutic work is to get to know, have a much more complete understanding of the young person or child, and an acknowledgement of the kinds of things that you're talking about. And in those circumstances, the child is often, if not always, able to accept um, that what they did went against their own sense of personal ethics or of ethics. Um, and you said there's a transformative shame associated with that.
yeah.
So there's kind of two questions in there. What do you say when people say you should be talking about that, and maybe what you also think is is the transformation that occurs with that shame?
See, I'm when it comes to uh, repositioning shame, I'm interested in how to deal with the mistaken shame, with the that little boy who's tries to help his mum. His dad knocks him aside, says you're a waste of space. How how do we find how do we acknowledge that shame is there? He feels he's not capable, he's not up to it, he's not good enough. But there's also more to him, as I said. There's something
Mm,
about his efforts in trying and his courage, his loyalty, and so we're looking at creating a space that is relevant to him, not what I want him to do, not
mm,
that I want him to face up to what he's done because that's what he should do. That's my moral imperative for him. I'm interested in what he's capable of.
mm,
And I'm interested in the fact that if he is in a space where he can identify that he values fairness. He tries to stick up for himself.
mm,
He values loyalty. He loves his mum. He misses her incredibly. He might have a grandma somewhere who has had his back in the past. That's been really helpful. Um, and out of bringing forward or helping to name that there's more to him than him being a loser.
mm,
There's more to him than him feeling ashamed that he's not good enough. In fact, there's strivings that he has. That out of that will probably come some awareness that this behavior is not okay that he's engaged in. And he will see that, like this
mm,
boy did. Um, he will he will have a moment where he notices, like I see that with with adults who've hurt their children, like
mm,
who know that that behavior is wrong. But then there's a moment sometimes where, thinking of one particular man who was really trying hard to forge a less aggressive kind of relationship with his son, and he was at an access visit and he went to shake his son's hand in a moment of wanting to show respect for something the son had done. And the son saw the hand coming and flinched.
yeah,
But
yeah,
this man saw the flinch. For the
mm,
first time, he saw his son's fear.
mm,
And that these moments, they don't come from somebody dictating,
no,
you've got to face up to what you've done to your boy. They come from an immanent sense they come from that form of shame that is, that kind of enables the seeing. I see the other for the first time. And that's a form of otherness that, like, to me, the antithesis of violence is really, sort of a passionate interest in otherness. And if we become interested in the other, and we need to do that out of our own ethics, we can't have somebody tell us you should be interested in the other, then the possibilities for that arising are present. And that is purely ethical. It's not moral. It's not, it's not, sort of pushed from outside or demanded or as an imperative. It's something that's immanent, that arises. And even some of the most, the kids that seem to be, limited in their capacities around thinking or whatever, the sense of being able to see the other is something you can generally engage with if there's a respectful and resonant connection there. That it's really based on if we are hoping the person we're working with will stop and think about the experience of the other, particularly the other that they've heard. What does it mean if we don't stop and think about their experience of us? There's something in the nature of there's a parallel journey that we're on here. And if we start to expect, well, there's a cartoon I love, which I think it's Kathy Wilcox, and it's got a child talking to the parent, and the child's saying, how come it's evil and underhanded when they do it, but heroic and wonderful when we do it? And the parent says, without missing a beat, what part of us and them don't you understand? and I kind of think, this to me about a relationship we have with whether it's an adult or a child, it's not what we say, it's what we do that is relevant here. And if I'm hoping that the man I'm working with or the boy I'm working with will realize something about the impact of his actions upon another, then I want to be absolutely attuned to the impact of my actions upon this child. Otherwise, it's a kind of it's an overload. It's somehow expecting something that we're not providing. And to me, that is a critical part, I think, of I think of any therapeutic work in any field, to be honest.
Yeah. You've talked about shame, another emotion that is prominent, I guess. You could call it emotion, you could call it a process, I guess, as well as guilt. And I wonder how you distinguish the relative places of shame and guilt.
Yeah. So it's a good question, because guilt gets tossed around. Guilt is sort of shame light. To understand something about shame, like from the place I come from, is really affect theory and the people like Tompkins, Panksepp, Shaw, who kind of are the neuroaffective science mob, who I think have the clearest understanding of that. And they see panic loss, they see shame often working together as kind of primary affect systems. They're the systems that animate behavior. If we're looking at Spinoza talked about bodies connecting. He talked about the conatus of a body, which is its tendency, its capacity to endure, to exist, to continue its own existence, and it's through connection with other bodies, affect and be affected by other bodies. Now, if we look at how bodies move in an assemblage or in a network, how they connect, There are politics that set directions, the social ordering politics, the various kind of requirements and demands. But bodies move that through force, through affect, and it's affect that animates this kind of movement. And some of the primary affects associated with connection, panic, loss, shame, that are vital. How could we have connection how could we have ethical connection without shame? I mean, look at some of the leaders around the world who demonstrate a seemingly shameless kind of way of operating. Shame is that attunement, that sensitivity to the experience of the other, that helps us set limits, that helps us respect boundaries, that helps us form discretion where we know where to tread or where not to tread. And to have connection without shame. I heard of a German guy, Schneider, said to extirpate shame from relationships would be like taking the brakes off a car because they slow it down. Like this is kind of a vital aspect, and the formation of an ethical compass is really contingent on imminent shame. Now, if we look at shame, has an affective force to it. It can feel toxic, like it's not easy to manage, as we know. We experience, Raymond Gator talks about remorse. He says, when we have that sense of the shock of wrongdoing the other, that, oh my God, what have I done? How could I have done that? I mean, it's a horrible feeling, but yet it's a vital feeling in a way, like of forming discretion in connection. Now compare that with guilt. Guilt doesn't have much affective force. Guilt is more a cognitive idea. It works well in courts of law and things like that. Guilt can be dealt with through forgiveness or punishment. The guilty can then let it go. Shame actually engages our bodies. Shame holds us in a place. In fact, we might run away from it, but it will follow us. It kind of, until we find a way to actually hold it and address it and recognize the importance and the necessity of it. I think guilt is often a shame avoidance thing. People like to, in this area, people like to say, well, no, guilt is good because you can say to people, yeah, you're a good person, but you've done a bad thing. And now, I don't mind the concept of a person recognizing that there's goodness and that they've done a bad thing, but it's how you get to that point. You don't get to it through cheap guilt. You get to it through a struggle, and you need to be able to see the other to be able to really recognize there's something of integrity in feeling shame. You need to be able to hold the hurt that you've done. You need to be able to hold shame in a way and to bear it, to be able to genuinely, I suppose, move into that space of recognizing that there's integrity in that. And there's a suffering in that too, but it's real. Whereas I think, and then people can work to a point of recognizing that, as this boy I was talking about, he starts to think. I ask him things. I'm helping him to hold this. So if you could see that little girl and you didn't feel bad, what would that say about you? And he says, I'd be just a shit, What does it mean what is it taking for you to be here with me and we're looking at that little girl together? What is that taking? Is it courage? Is it how much? Where do you feel that in your body? Where do you feel shame? How big is the feeling of courage there? So we're looking at how at repair, in a way. We're looking at a notion of integrity, of being real, of being true to the values. Like, you couldn't do this if he hadn't identified the fact that he's a kid who's stuck up for other people, who's tried to look out, who loves his mum, who loves his siblings, who misses them incredibly, who's tried to help them. You couldn't do that work then with shame without that first bit being there, that is about him. And again, it's where it's important. It's not about me. It's not about that I think he should feel this way, or it's the fact that when he does, of helping him make sense of that, of helping him see what that says about him, what it means about him as a person, how it fits with the man he wants to be, that of helping him hold that in a way that has ethical integrity to it. That to me is where, and I don't, in my mind, the idea of guilt doesn't really cut it, because it doesn't have the emotional force, doesn't have the affective force in it. You can move into it, but to start there is not authentic in my mind.
Yeah. Previous guest, Lisa Etherson, author of Shame Containment Theory, was talking about in her research, what she had noticed is that Freud pretty quickly moved away from shame into guilt.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and it may have been a shameful move. I don't know. But there's a number of stories about possibilities there that I won't go into, but it's been ignored. I started my career in the 70s, and that shame back then was seen as just a problem. It gets in the way. You need to get rid of it. You need to throw it off because it stops us from flourishing and from doing the things that we want to do. And yet, you look at the processes of working with the kind of shame that, we need to stand apart from. This young man, I do have permission to tell stories about. So he'd been, as a sort of early moving into adolescence boy, he'd been sexually abused by a church youth group leader, and he felt incredible shame. He felt this sense of, I shouldn't have let this happen. I should have stopped it. I should have, I'm just a bad person, the sense of culpability and worthlessness was incredible. But he made a statement at one point that said, as he was working on this stuff, this just followed a suicide attempt where he'd taken all his mum's tablets and wound up being in hospital. And they were saying to him, it's not your fault, it's not your fault. But they weren't engaging with his shame. This was an imperative. Take the shame away. It's not your fault because I think it's not your fault. But, for this boy, there was a moment where he was looking at, he made a statement that said, now I think the abusing person was trying to bribe me. And then he said, but I still wanted the things he bought me. Okay, so now his emphasis is on, I still wanted the things he bought me. So the sense I had from it was mistaken shame. And I thought, rather than if you tell him it's not your fault, what's that going to mean? It's just my opinion. But instead, I asked him, tell me about this bribe. What do you mean? Now, I think he was trying, this was the minor part of his statement. It is. To me, it was the major part. What do you mean bribe? What is a bribe? How was he trying to bribe you?
Mm.
Why do you think he was giving you those? What do you think he had in his mind? So we started to. This is not psychological work. This is political work. It's looking at the politics of grooming and and the setting up here. And then, as he was thinking, you could see his eyes go up, and this look of disdain came across his face. I said, "What are you seeing?" And he had an image of this man giving him his car keys. So, as a 12-year-old, he let him drive his car. And that was so cool. But he was seeing, I said, "What are you seeing?" He said, "I can see his smirk." And the smirk, and I said, "What's that smirk? What's it saying? What?" And then he kind of looked enraged, and he said, "He knows." And this is an affective moment here where another connection around shame is actually operating, where from that point, there was a real difference. He was able to start to discriminate. Whose shame is this? Where does this shame lie? Who is culpable in this particular situation? Yeah, so I'm particularly concerned about how we engage with shame affectively, and looking at where guilt and things like this come into it they don't have the affective force that shame does, but they also are not easy. This kind of work is never easy to hold. And we all know, like when we've felt ashamed about something that we've done, we know what it's like to carry that and how to try and repair and what that means. And sometimes things you can't undo. There are things we can't repair. There's damage done that can't be undone. There are all sorts of things that come with this. But sorry, I don't know whether I'm staying with your question even now.
Well, I think
forgot what the question was.
You lead me to be wondering. You lead me to be wondering what advice would you give, or what do you think it's really important for people who are working, professionals who are working in this space, to understand, to know? And I guess when you said it's really difficult work, and it is, I wondered particularly about your thoughts about supervision and what that would look like.
About supervision of
Practitioners.
I think my focus is always on becoming attuned with our own affects, our own panic loss, our own, when we're working with somebody and we start to worry, are we connecting properly? Are we getting through? And how our panic and the panic of the person that we see, who often feels this person's going to shame me, is going to put something or have an expectation of me, how we attune our affective experiences, how we attune to our own shame too. That one of the biggest things in this work when I'm supervising people is the tendency to the urgency that often workers have, that I've got to get in, I've got to make a change here, I've got to make this happen, and how that urgency is picked up as a demand by the client, who then rightfully resists it. If I'm a client somewhere and my therapist starts to tell me what I should think or how I should resist that. I should stick up for myself. That person has no right to do that. And then how often, as a worker, that we become then worried about our own adequacy, our own capacity. Am I doing well enough? Am I getting through? Now, these are the exact same affects that are experienced by clients who are panicking about the connection and worried about feeling judged, by us. And how we listen to our clients and how we attune in there is probably the biggest thing. When we start to hear, when we, like, for example, that boy I'm talking about, if I start to get urgent about needing him to face up to the fact that he's abused, I mean, that's important. I guess the work is about helping him to be able to do that very thing. But if it becomes at my urgency and my, I'm pushing that, I become a kind of colonizing force to some way in that person's life. I start to the resistance that he might build, the protest is what I prefer to call it. This is a two-way street. I'm encouraging that, and it can escalate, and that's why you often have men, come into a therapy, and they pick up judgment, and they react. You people, you're always on the woman's side, like it, there's that we contribute to that. And we need to be able to step back and listen and find out what's important for them. But with that boy, I was not interested in making him face up to something. I knew he wouldn't be able to do that. And it would be putting an impossible demand on him. But I saw that there was some energy. And I often find that around protest. Sometimes a kid will protest a bit about even being there and kind of having been sent to see me and things like that. And I'm interested in that. I like that. I like the fact that a kid will stick up for himself, and even though his mum's saying, now you talk to Mr. Jenkins,
Yes.
And I engage with that because I love, and offer, because in a sense, for young people to break out of a social ordering process that diminishes them and makes them feel like losers and disconnects them, I think it needs protest. It needs sticking up for yourself. And of course, the initial protest is often a bit misguided. It might even be harmful to others. So I guess my sense in supervision is much more geared around what I call the parallel journey of how we're aware of our own reactions and responses, and how we become interested in the other, how we don't let our urgency or our shame or whatever stop us from becoming interested in what's important for the other person. And most people I work with, beyond their blaming or contemptuous behaviour, whatever, abusive behaviour, whatever it may be, there's generally something more. There's generally something else that they're interested in. And I often find I get all of that. If I'm getting all of that sort of reactive behaviour, I'm asking myself, what am I doing that perhaps is inviting that in a way? How am I participating in this in a way? How can I step out of that and notice what else is there? Like I have a lot of kids might say to me, I don't know what all the fuss is about. I didn't hurt her. And I hear that statement, I didn't hurt her. And I hear more than just a denial in that or a minimization. I hear this person probably has some sense of what hurt does. And what would it mean to him if he realized that he really had hurt her? What would that mean? So I file it away, and it's there at some point where I know it'll be a useful thing to, a boy who tried to protect his family, who some kids do incredible things. Like you imagine the stepfather's come home, is drunk, starting to fight with mum, and this 9-year-old, he's hearing this happening, and he has an idea, and he gets his little brother to hide in a trunk. Then he runs into the room where dad's about to hurt mum, says, Mum, David's run away. And the fight stops and everyone, where the heck is David? And goes out searching. And I hear a story like that, and I think of a little boy who's come up with that brilliant kind of smart idea. And and I'm intrigued with what that's about, and this and I hear that he looked after he'd get his sister and his little brother to hide away, protect them when there was alcohol around the house and stuff. And I hear that, in fact, his little sister saw him almost as a bodyguard. And then some years later, he sexually abuses her. Now, you think, if you don't know the story of this boy who's tried his best to look out for his sister, and so once I understand something about, there's a lot more to him. He's another kid that says he doesn't have any empathy in the reports. How's he done all of this around his sister? And but that at a later point, when we've established something about what's important to him, and I can ask him something like, "Can I ask you something about you? What happened with your sister? How did she see you? How did she look to you before this happened?" And then there's a sense of shame because this bodyguard thing is in his mind. I was her bodyguard, and then I went and did this to her. It's not me shaming him. It's me asking him to step into a space where he can see her, where he can experience something, and then helping him hold that of what it means to be a brother who realizes when you've hurt your sister that, hey, that's not okay, of seeing her, what this says about you, what you want to do about it, become really important issues.
Yeah. I've really enjoyed speaking to you about these things.
Yeah, I've had fun.
These matters. Alan, I hope you've enjoyed the process as well. A lot of what you said very much aligns with the work that I do as well. And so I feel validated listening to you speak in the way that you have. And I hope other people in the sector listening to you feel the same way. And there was such a lot to draw from and think about in that. I'm not going to call it a conversation. I was soaking up as much as I could of your wisdom.
Yeah, I think it became a bit of a rave at times, or a rant.
Well, like you said, you're a protester. You like to, you have a history of standing up for.
Yeah, it's my multi-undisciplinary nature. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thanks, Alan. That was great. And
thanks for the opportunity, Colby.
Yeah. It may well be great it'll undoubtedly be great to perhaps catch up with you again another time.
Yeah. Enjoyed it.